June 7, 1944. A German bunker in Normandy is destroyed in a single shot. Moments earlier, the men inside were laughing. They were laughing at a British tank with a weapon that looked ridiculous, a short wide tube where a proper gun should be. Then it fired. 1 meter of reinforced concrete collapsed inward. The men inside were crushed, buried, or killed instantly. A position that had survived artillery and air attacks for more than a year was erased in seconds. This is the story of Britain's so-called Dustbin gun. A weapon that looked like a joke, was mocked by German defenders, and then shattered their strongest fortresses, breaking the idea that concrete could still protect them in war. By the afternoon of 1944, the fighting inland from Sword Beach had settled into a familiar rhythm. Smoke drifted low across shattered villages. Stone houses lay open like broken shells, their walls torn apart by naval fire and airstrikes from the day before. German defenders who had survived the landings believed the worst was over. They had endured far heavier bombardments before, and their concrete positions were built for exactly this kind of moment. Oberfeldwebel Karl Brenner commanded one of those positions. His bunker sat beside the main road running through a small Norman village, 3 miles from the coast. It was not an improvised field position, but a reinforced concrete pillbox designed to stop an advance cold. The walls were a full meter thick. Steel bars were embedded inside the concrete. Narrow firing slits covered the road and overlapped with neighboring bunkers, creating a killing zone that any attacker would have to cross. Brenner and his squad had occupied this bunker for 18 months. During that time, they had repelled probing attacks, patrols, and harassment fire. British artillery had shelled the area more than once. Aircraft had dropped bombs nearby. Each time, the bunker shook, dust fell from the ceiling, and then everything settled back into place. The structure always held. Concrete cracked, but it never failed. This history shaped Brenner's confidence. The British had been ashore for barely 30 hours. Their infantry was advancing carefully now, using ruined buildings for cover, moving in short rushes between doorways and collapsed walls. Brenner had seen this before in other sectors. Infantry alone could not take a bunker like his without paying a terrible price. When his machine gunner opened fire, the British soldiers dropped back instantly. Bullets sparked off stone and masonry. The road in front of the bunker became empty again. Inside, Brenner felt the familiar calm that came with routine. This was how these fights always went. Infantry tested the defenses. They failed. Then the real fight began. From Brenner's experience, the next step was predictable. The British would call for artillery support. Guns further inland or offshore would pound the bunker with high explosive shells. The concrete would absorb the punishment. Maybe a firing slit would be damaged. Maybe debris would block part of the entrance. But the bunker would remain usable. After that, the attack would stall. Either the British would withdraw, or they would wait for reinforcements. This expectation was shared by everyone inside. The bunker was not just a position. It was protection. Thick concrete separated the defenders from the chaos outside. The men trusted it more than any weapon they carried. Then Brenner noticed movement on the road that did not fit the pattern. A British tank rolled forward from behind the ruined buildings. At first glance, it looked like a Churchill, slow and heavy, designed for rough ground. But something about it felt wrong. Brenner leaned closer to the firing slit. Where the main gun should have been, there was only a short stubby tube. It barely extended beyond the turret face. It was far too wide and far too short to be a proper tank gun. One of the gunners squinted and tried to make sense of it. The shape looked crude, ugly, almost ridiculous. Someone joked that it looked like a dustbin bolted onto the tank. The men laughed, nervous laughter at first, then louder. Tanks were dangerous, but tank guns were long and narrow, built for velocity and penetration. This thing had neither. Whatever it was, it did not look threatening. The tank kept coming. It did not fire on the move. It advanced slowly, then deliberately, closing the distance until it stopped roughly 80 meters from the bunker. That was uncomfortably close, but Brenner still felt no real fear. At that range, a normal tank gun firing high explosive might damage the surface of the bunker, but it would not break through. The turret rotated. The short tube pointed directly at the firing slit. There was a moment of silence. Brenner expected the sharp crack of a gun, the flash, the impact against concrete. Instead, the sound was deep and hollow, more like a heavy hammer striking an enormous drum. It was not loud in the usual way. It felt heavy, as if the air itself had been struck. Something emerged from the tube and arced through the air. Brenner could see it clearly. It moved slowly enough to follow with the eye. It was not a shell in the normal sense. It tumbled slightly as it flew, a large metal cylinder spinning awkwardly. In that instant, the joke about the dustbin stopped being funny. The object looked exactly like that, a flying metal container drifting toward the bunker. It struck the front wall just to the left of the main firing slit. The explosion that followed was unlike anything Brenner had experienced. There was no sharp blast wave outside followed by fragments bouncing off the wall. Instead, the shock seemed to come from everywhere at once. The force traveled through the concrete itself. The bunker groaned. Then the front wall collapsed inward as if it had been pulled apart from the inside. A meter-thick wall of reinforced concrete disintegrated. Steel bars twisted and snapped. The firing slit vanished under falling rubble. Dust and debris filled the interior in an instant. The machine gun position ceased to exist. Brenner was thrown backward. His ears rang violently. For several seconds he could see nothing but gray dust. He tasted concrete in his mouth. When his vision cleared, the bunker he had trusted for 18 months was gone. The front wall was open to the outside. Part of the roof had collapsed. 3 of his men were buried under broken concrete and steel. The laughter from moments earlier was replaced by silence and screams. There was no second shot. None was needed. The British infantry approached cautiously, weapons raised. Brenner crawled out through the wreckage, stunned and bleeding, and surrendered. He glanced back once at the remains of the bunker. It no longer looked like a defensive position. It looked like a collapsed building after an earthquake. 80 meters away, the British tank sat still. Its strange weapon was already turning toward another bunker down the road. For Brenner, understanding came too late. The weapon that had destroyed his position was not meant to duel tanks or trade fire at long range. It was built for one purpose: to erase fortifications that men like him believed were invulnerable. That moment marked a quiet but decisive shift. German doctrine was built on the idea that concrete provided safety. Fortified positions were meant to protect defenders while they inflicted losses on attackers. What Brenner witnessed was the opposite. The bunker did not save its occupants. It killed them. As the British advance continued through Normandy, this realization would spread faster than any official order. The bunker that never fell had fallen in a single second, and with it fell the belief that concrete walls could still decide the battle. The destruction of Brenner's bunker was not an isolated moment. It was the first clear warning of something new moving through the Norman countryside. British infantry who had watched the explosion understood immediately that the rules had changed. Positions that had pinned them down for hours could now be erased in seconds. German defenders who witnessed it felt something far worse than fear. They felt disbelief. Along the road beyond the shattered bunker, other German positions were already on alert. Machine gun crews stayed low behind firing slits, expecting the familiar sequence of events: infantry advance, suppressive fire, artillery preparation, then another attempt. That pattern had held across Europe from North Africa to Italy. It had shaped how bunkers were designed and how soldiers fought inside them. But the British tanks advancing with the infantry were not behaving like normal tanks. They did not hang back and fire from distance. They did not trade shots with anti-tank guns. They moved slowly and deliberately toward specific points in the defense. They closed the distance until they were close enough to be hit by handheld weapons. This made no sense to German observers trained to recognize tank behavior. One bunker commander ordered his gunners to concentrate fire on the strange tank as it approached. Bullets sparked harmlessly off thick armor. The tank did not change speed. It did not fire back. It simply continued forward until it reached the same short distance Brenner had seen. The short, thick tube turned toward the bunker. The defenders had seconds to react and no idea what to do with them. The sound came again, the same deep, hollow thump. The same slow-moving object arcing through the air. Men inside the bunker watched it approach, some frozen, others instinctively ducking. The impact erased the front wall. The bunker collapsed inward. Those who survived the blast stumbled out in shock or lay buried under concrete. Word spread quickly along the defensive line. German soldiers began to recognize the silhouette. The Churchill tank was familiar, but this version was different. The short, stubby weapon was unmistakable. Once it appeared, staying inside a bunker meant waiting to die. German officers attempted to reassert control. Orders were shouted, positions were supposed to be held. Fortifications existed for a reason, leaving them meant exposure to infantry fire. But the logic that supported those orders no longer matched what soldiers were seeing with their own eyes. The bunker was no longer a shield. It was a trap. British infantry exploited this confusion. When the demolition tanks advanced, riflemen followed closely behind. They moved faster than expected, using the destroyed bunkers as cover. Where resistance collapsed, they pushed through immediately instead of waiting for consolidation. The pace of the advance increased not because the infantry had changed, but because the obstacles ahead of them were disappearing. Behind the front line, British commanders observed the effect with growing confidence. The demolition tanks were doing exactly what they had been designed to do. Strongpoints that had resisted artillery and naval gunfire were eliminated with single rounds. Time that would have been spent coordinating fire missions was saved. Lives that would have been lost in frontal assaults were preserved. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical destruction. German soldiers began to associate the sound of the firing thump with death. Unlike artillery, which arrived after long preparation, this weapon appeared suddenly and struck without warning. There was no shelter from it, no depth of concrete that mattered. Some German units attempted to respond aggressively. Anti-tank guns were repositioned to cover likely approaches. Crews were ordered to watch for the demolition tanks and engage them as soon as possible. This was easier said than done. The tanks rarely advanced alone. Infantry protected them, other tanks covered them. Smoke obscured their movement. Firing on them exposed gun positions to immediate retaliation. In a few cases, German gunners succeeded. A demolition tank hit during its approach or reload was vulnerable. The loading process required a crew member to expose himself outside the turret. German riflemen and machine gunners targeted these moments. Losses occurred. Crews were killed or wounded. Tanks were disabled, but these successes were rare and costly. Every gun that revealed itself was quickly suppressed. As the day wore on, a pattern emerged. When demolition tanks were spotted, defenders abandoned their bunkers. They fled through trenches or rear exits, trying to escape before the tanks closed in. This was not formal doctrine. It was survival instinct. Soldiers who stayed inside had seen what happened to those who did not leave in time. This behavior alarmed German commanders. The entire defensive system relied on fixed positions holding ground. If bunkers were abandoned, the defensive line dissolved into isolated infantry fighting in the open. That was a battle the Germans were increasingly unprepared to win, especially against armor-supported advances. Reports filtered up the chain of command. They were difficult to interpret at first. Descriptions of a tank-mounted weapon that destroyed reinforced concrete bunkers with a single shot sounded exaggerated. Some staff officers suspected panic or confusion. Artillery could do that kind of damage, but not tanks. Yet the reports kept coming, consistent in detail and outcome. British engineers observed the effects closely. They noted not only the destruction, but the reaction. Defenders who once fought stubbornly from cover now ran when the demolition tanks appeared. The weapon had achieved something rare. It had broken the enemy's trust in his own defenses. This shift had immediate tactical consequences. Routes that were expected to be blocked for hours opened quickly. Road junctions cleared. Village centers fell with less resistance. Infantry commanders who had planned for slow, costly progress found themselves moving faster than anticipated. For the German side, the realization was grim. The Atlantic Wall and its inland extensions had been built on assumptions that no longer held. Concrete walls were meant to absorb punishment. Interlocking fire was meant to stop movement. Depth was meant to buy time. The demolition tanks ignored all of this. They did not need penetration, they needed proximity. By the evening of June 7, 1944, the laughter that had greeted the strange British weapon was gone. In its place was a quiet understanding spreading among German units. When those tanks appeared, the fight changed. Staying inside concrete meant death. Leaving it meant exposure, but at least there was a chance to run. The battlefield had delivered its verdict. A weapon that looked absurd had shattered not just bunkers, but the confidence of the men inside them. And as British forces continued to push inland, that loss of confidence would prove just as decisive as the destruction itself. The shock felt by German defenders on June 7 did not come from a single destroyed bunker. It came from the sudden collapse of an idea that had shaped the war for years. German defensive doctrine was built around fortifications because experience had proven their value. Concrete worked, steel reinforcement worked. Fixed positions allowed smaller forces to hold ground against larger attackers. This belief had been reinforced again and again across Europe. From North Africa to Italy, German engineers refined bunker design. Field positions were replaced by permanent structures. Walls grew thicker, roofs were reinforced. Firing slits were angled to deflect incoming shells. Positions were arranged to support one another, creating overlapping fields of fire that punished any frontal attack. Infantry were trained to fight from inside these structures, trusting that the concrete around them was stronger than anything the enemy could deliver quickly. Conventional weapons struggled against the system. Tank guns were designed for armor, not buildings. A long, narrow barrel firing a high-velocity shell could punch through steel, but concrete absorbed the impact differently. Armor-piercing rounds cracked and chipped bunker walls without penetrating deeply. High-explosive shells were better, but they still required repeated hits on the same point. Against a well-built bunker, that was rarely possible under fire. Artillery remained the most reliable solution. A sustained barrage from multiple guns could eventually destroy almost any fortification. But artillery came with serious limitations. It required planning, coordination, and enormous amounts of ammunition. Guns had to be positioned. Fire missions had to be calculated. Forward observers had to maintain contact. All of this took time. During an assault, time meant casualties. Infantry attacks without heavy support were worse. Assaulting a bunker frontally meant crossing open ground under machine gun fire. Even brave and well-trained troops suffered heavily. This reality shaped battlefield behavior. Infantry waited for artillery. Artillery delayed advances. Delays allowed defenders to reinforce or withdraw in good order. Fortifications bought time, and time favored the defender. By 1944, the Atlantic Wall represented the peak of this thinking. Thousands of bunkers, casemates, and strongpoints covered the coastline of Western Europe. Each position was carefully placed to support others. Beach exits were covered by concrete guns. Villages inland were turned into fortified nodes. Roads were watched by pillboxes built directly into embankments and buildings. German commanders believed the system would bleed any invasion force white. Even if the Allies landed successfully, the advance inland would be slow and costly. Reinforcements would arrive. Counterattacks would be launched. The invasion could still fail. British planners understood the problem clearly. They had studied it through hard experience. In earlier campaigns, they had seen assaults stall in front of fortified positions. They had seen artillery chew through ammunition stocks. They had seen infantry pay the price when fortifications could not be eliminated quickly. The challenge was simple, but severe. Assault forces needed a way to destroy bunkers immediately at the moment of contact. They could not wait for hours of preparation. They could not rely on aircraft that might not arrive. They needed a weapon that could move with the infantry, survive small arms fire, and deliver enough explosive force to collapse reinforced concrete in one strike. This requirement forced British engineers to think differently. Penetration was not the answer. Shaped charges were still unreliable against thick reinforced walls. High-velocity shells wasted energy passing through material that did not behave like armor. What mattered was not punching a hole, but breaking the structure itself. Concrete was strong against impact from the outside. It was weaker against internal stress. A blast that traveled through the material could cause fractures that reinforcement bars could not stop. If the internal strength of the wall failed, the entire structure would collapse. The idea was not entirely new. Demolition charges had been used by engineers for years. The problem was delivery. Infantry could place charges only if they reached the wall, which was rarely possible under fire. Artillery delivered blasts from above or at an angle, often spreading the force. What was needed was a way to place a massive explosive charge directly against the face of a bunker, under armor protection at short range. This thinking led to an unconventional solution. Instead of mounting a larger gun, British engineers chose to mount a demolition weapon. The platform would be a tank, heavily armored and slow, able to approach under fire. The weapon would not rely on speed or accuracy at long range. It would rely on brute force at close range. The result was the Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, known as the AVRE. Based on the Churchill tank, it replaced the main gun with a spigot mortar called the petard. To anyone unfamiliar with it, the weapon looked crude. The barrel was short and thick. There was no elegant shape, no suggestion of precision engineering. It looked more like industrial equipment than a military weapon. This appearance caused doubt even among British troops. Soldiers were used to judging power by barrel length. Long guns meant range and penetration. Short, wide tubes suggested weakness. The petard defied that logic completely. Instead of firing a shell from inside a barrel, the spigot mortar launched a large explosive bomb from a fixed rod. The projectile carried its own propellant charge. This design removed the limits imposed by barrel diameter. The bomb could be far larger than anything a conventional gun could fire. The petard projectile was a massive cylinder filled with high explosive. Troops quickly gave it a nickname that matched its appearance: Flying Dustbin. It was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. Its purpose was to deliver overwhelming blast at point-blank range. The effective range was short, around 80 to 100 meters. Accuracy dropped rapidly beyond that. This was not a flaw, it was a design choice. The AVRE was meant to drive straight at fortifications, stop, and fire. At that distance, missing was unlikely. Survival depended on armor and speed of action, not range. This approach solved the fortress problem in a way no conventional weapon could. A single AVRE could destroy bunkers that would otherwise require hours of artillery fire. It could do so on demand, at the exact moment infantry needed it. The cost was risk. The tank had to get close. Reloading required exposure. Losses were expected. British engineers accepted that risk because the alternative was worse. Without such a weapon, assaults would continue to stall. Casualties would continue to mount. The Atlantic Wall would remain what it was intended to be. By the time the AVRE reached Normandy, the theory was about to be tested under the most demanding conditions possible. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fire, experienced defenders. Everything the weapon had been designed to defeat. What German defenders experienced on June 7th was not an accident or improvisation. It was the result of a clear understanding of the fortress problem and a willingness to solve it in a way that looked strange, risky, and almost absurd. In the fields and villages of Normandy, that solution was already proving decisive. The AVRE was never meant to look impressive. Its purpose was practical, not elegant. When British units first trained with it, reactions were mixed. Tank crews were used to weapons that reached far and struck fast. The petard didn't either. It demanded patience, nerve, and a willingness to move straight toward danger. Yet once its effect was seen, doubts faded quickly. The Churchill tank was chosen as the base for a reason. It was slow, but it was heavily armored. Its thick plates could absorb small arms fire and most anti-tank weapons at short range. It could climb rough ground, cross obstacles, and keep moving where lighter vehicles bogged down. These qualities mattered more than speed. The AVRE was not meant to maneuver in open tank battles. It was meant to survive long enough to reach a bunker. The petard mortar dominated the turret. Where a normal gun barrel extended forward, the AVRE carried a short wide tube barely reaching beyond the armor. Inside, a fixed steel rod served as the firing point. The projectile slid over this rod during loading. When fired, the charge inside the bomb ignited and launched it forward with a heavy thump. Each projectile weighed 40 pounds and carried 18 kilograms of high explosive. It was closer to a demolition charge than a shell. When it struck a surface, the explosion did not focus on penetration. It spread force outward and inward at the same time. Against concrete, this was devastating. Loading the weapon was dangerous and slow. Unlike normal tank guns, it could not be loaded from inside the turret. A crewman had to open the hatch, stand partially exposed, and manually place the heavy bomb onto the spigot. This took time even in calm conditions. In combat, under fire, it was nerve-testing work. Around 2 minutes passed between shots if everything went smoothly. British crews developed routines to reduce the risk. Other tanks provided cover. Infantry laid down suppressive fire. Smoke was used whenever possible. Reloads were done behind walls, hedgerows, or the remains of destroyed bunkers. Even so, the danger remained. Crews accepted it because they knew what the weapon could do. Training emphasized timing and coordination. The AVRE did not fire repeatedly like a normal tank. Each shot mattered. Targets were chosen carefully. The tank advanced, stopped, fired, and then either withdrew or shifted position while reloading. The moment of firing was brief but decisive. This approach required close cooperation with infantry. Riflemen protected the tank as it moved forward. In return, the AVRE removed the obstacles that pinned infantry down. The relationship was immediate and visible. When the demolition tank arrived, infantry knew help had come. In Normandy, this cooperation matured quickly. The first encounters confirmed every expectation. Bunkers that had resisted hours of shelling collapsed after a single hit. Fortified houses turned into piles of rubble. Roadblocks built into embankments vanish. The battlefield changed shape in minutes. The blast effect was the key. When the flying dustbin struck a bunker wall, the explosion sent shockwaves through the concrete. Reinforcement bars that gave strength against penetration became useless. The concrete fractured internally. Whole sections failed at once. Roofs caved in. Walls folded inward. Anyone inside was crushed, buried, or killed by the pressure. German defenders learned that there was no safe place within the structure. Even corners and rear walls offered no protection. The explosion did not need to breach an opening. It simply broke the building apart. British commanders noted another important detail. Accuracy was less critical than proximity. Even a near hit could collapse a structure. The sheer mass of explosive ensured that precise aim was not required. This reduced the stress on crews and allowed faster engagements. As the advance continued inland, AVREs were assigned to priority targets. Bunkers covering roads, fortified villages, concrete gun positions that blocked movement. They were not spread thinly across the line. They were concentrated where the resistance was strongest. This concentration magnified their impact. German units facing an AVRE-supported assault experienced a sudden and total loss of defensive advantage. Positions that had been carefully prepared over months disappeared in moments. There was no time to adapt. Attempts to counter the AVRE increased. German anti-tank guns were pushed forward. Ambush positions were prepared. Orders emphasized early engagement. But the nature of the weapon made this difficult. The AVRE did not announce itself with long-range fire. It appeared suddenly at close distance. By the time it was clearly identified, it was often too late. Losses did occur. Some AVREs were knocked out by well-placed fire. Some crews were hit during reload. These incidents were costly and painful. But they did not change the overall balance. The number of bunkers destroyed far outweighed the vehicles lost. For British troops, confidence grew. Infantry who had once dreaded approaching fortified villages now moved forward with expectation. They knew that if resistance hardened, the demolition tanks would be called. This knowledge reduced hesitation and increased momentum. The weapon also simplified planning. Commanders no longer needed to allocate long artillery preparation for every strong point. They could move faster, react to unexpected resistance, and exploit breakthroughs. Time became an ally instead of an enemy. For German defenders, the opposite was true. Time worked against them. Every minute increased the chance that an AVRE would appear. Staying in place became dangerous. Movement in the open was risky, but so was remaining inside concrete. By the end of the first days inland, the AVRE had proven itself beyond doubt. It was not a curiosity. It was not a gimmick. It was a purpose-built solution to a specific problem that had plagued armies for years. The strange-looking tank had answered the fortress problem with brute force and simplicity. It did not argue with concrete. It did not test it. It destroyed it. As Normandy became a proving ground, one fact was clear to both sides. Fortifications no longer guaranteed survival. And the weapon that made that clear was only just beginning its work. By the morning of June 8, 1944, the pattern was clear on the ground. Wherever the British advance slowed, concrete was the reason. Wherever concrete stood, the AVRE was sent forward. What had begun as a specialized solution quickly became a central tool of the advance inland from the beaches. Villages that had been turned into strongpoints were no longer obstacles that required careful reduction over many hours. British infantry approached cautiously as always, but now they moved with expectation. They knew that if machine gun fire pinned them down from a bunker or fortified house, the answer would arrive on tracks. In one village after another, the scene repeated itself. Infantry reached the edge of open ground and took cover. German fire intensified from well-hidden positions built into stone buildings or earth-covered concrete shelters. Smoke rose. Casualties threatened to mount. Then the demolition tanks appeared. The AVREs moved at walking pace, engines rumbling steadily. Small arms fire rattled against their armor without effect. German gunners tried to adjust, to focus on vision slits and tracks, but panic crept in as the tanks kept coming. The short wide tubes turned toward the strongest points of resistance. At ranges that felt impossibly close, the petard fired. The flying dustbin arced slowly, almost lazily, before striking its target. Each impact reshaped the village. Walls vanished, roofs collapsed. Defensive positions that had anchored entire sections of the line disappeared in seconds. Infantry surged forward immediately. They did not wait. They did not pause to regroup. The destruction created gaps that had to be exploited before defenders could react. Streets that had been death traps moments earlier became corridors of advance. The speed of this process stunned German commanders. Reports from forward units described positions falling far faster than expected. Timetables collapsed. Planned counterattacks ran into British troops who had already passed through areas that were supposed to hold for half a day or more. The beach exits told the same story. These were among the strongest points of the Atlantic Wall. Concrete guns, interlocking fire, obstacles, and mines were meant to trap attackers at the waterline. The AVREs went to work there with brutal efficiency. Bunkers covering roads inland were destroyed one by one. Gaps opened where none were supposed to exist. British after-action reports emphasized the practical results. Bunkers that resisted tank fire and artillery were destroyed with single petard rounds. Infantry losses were reduced. Momentum was maintained. Commanders recommended increased allocation of demolition tanks for future assaults. The psychological impact continued to grow. German defenders learned to recognize the sound of the petard firing. The deep thump carried across fields and villages. When it was heard, men knew what followed. The slow arc of the projectile gave just enough time to understand what was coming and not enough time to escape if they stayed inside. This created a cruel dilemma. Orders demanded that positions be held. Training emphasized discipline and resistance. But experience showed that concrete was no longer protection. Many defenders chose to abandon bunkers at the first sign of an AVRE. They ran through rear exits, trenches, or fields, often under fire. This behavior weakened the defensive line even further. Empty bunkers could not fight back. Infantry in the open lacked heavy weapons and cover. Once dislodged, German units struggled to reform cohesive positions. The defensive system designed around fixed strong points unraveled into scattered resistance. German attempts to adapt were constant but ineffective. Anti-tank guns were pushed forward aggressively. Ambushes were planned near villages and road junctions. Some AVREs were hit and destroyed. These successes were celebrated locally, but they did not change the overall picture. Each anti-tank position that revealed itself was quickly suppressed by other British tanks or artillery. Infantry advanced behind the armor and cleared the ground. The cost of German gunners was high, and replacements were limited. The reload vulnerability of the AVRE was well understood by both sides. German troops tried to exploit it whenever possible. Snipers watched turret hatches. Machine gunners waited for the moment a crewman appeared. British crews responded by adapting their behavior. Reloads were done behind cover. Smoke screens were used more frequently. Infantry clustered around the tank during the process. These adaptations reduced losses and kept the demolition tanks in action. The weapon did not need a high rate of fire to be effective. One shot correctly placed was enough. As the advance continued, British commanders began to plan around the AVRE rather than merely include it. Assault routes were chosen with demolition support in mind. Strong points were identified early. Infantry movements were synchronized with the tanks. This coordination increased pressure on German defenders. There was no longer time to adjust between attacks. Once contact was made, destruction followed quickly. The sense of inevitability grew. German situation reports reflected this shift. Language changed. Where earlier documents spoke of holding positions and inflicting losses, new reports spoke of withdrawal and avoidance. Some commanders openly acknowledged that remaining in bunkers when demolition tanks approached was suicidal. This was a profound admission. The entire Atlantic Wall concept rested on the belief that fortifications would hold long enough to shape the battle. Now, they were being abandoned because they offered no protection. For British troops, the AVRE became a symbol of relief. Infantrymen who had faced bunkers in earlier campaigns understood the difference immediately. The fear of crossing open ground toward concrete firing slits was replaced by trust in the tank moving beside them. By the end of the Normandy fighting's first phase, the outcome was clear. The Atlantic Wall had not failed everywhere at once. It failed point by point, bunker by bunker, under the impact of a weapon designed to make fortifications irrelevant. What had been intended as an unbreakable barrier became a series of obstacles that could be erased on demand. The AVRE did not win the campaign alone, but it removed one of the greatest advantages the defenders possessed. Normandy did not fall because the Germans lacked courage or preparation. It fell because the battlefield had changed. Concrete no longer meant safety. Fixed positions no longer guaranteed control. And the strange British tank with the stubby weapon continued to roll forward, seeking the next bunker that still believed it could survive. By the middle of June 1944, The meaning of fortified defense in Normandy had changed completely. German troops did not need official orders to understand it. The battlefield taught the lesson faster than any command post ever could. Concrete no longer protected those inside it. In many cases, it guaranteed their death. German officers began to notice a pattern that disturbed them deeply. Bunkers that were fully manned one day were found empty the next. Rear exits were left open. Weapons were abandoned in firing positions. Defenders were choosing to leave their strongest shelters before British engineer tanks could reach them. This behavior was not cowardice, it was adaptation. Soldiers had watched comrades die inside structures that were supposed to keep them safe. They had felt the ground shake. They had seen entire walls vanish. Once that happened, a bunker was no longer a fighting position. It was a confined space waiting to collapse. Reports sent up the German chain of command became increasingly blunt. Frontline units described British tanks mounting short-wide weapons that destroyed reinforced concrete with a single shot. They reported that positions designed to survive prolonged bombardment were collapsing instantly. Some commanders openly stated that remaining in bunkers when these tanks approached was suicidal. At higher levels, these reports were difficult to accept at first. German doctrine placed great faith in engineering. The Atlantic Wall represented years of planning, labor, and material. Admitting that it could be undone by a single tank-mounted weapon was not easy. But the evidence continued to accumulate. Attempts to restore discipline met limited success. Orders were issued reminding troops of their duty to hold positions, but these orders collided with reality. Soldiers who had seen bunkers destroyed did not trust words over experience. When AVREs appeared, instinct took over. Survival mattered more than doctrine. The shift had serious consequences. Fortifications were meant to anchor the defense. Once they were abandoned, the entire system weakened. Infantry fighting in the open lacked cover and heavy weapons. Units became fragmented. Command and control broke down as men moved independently to avoid destruction. British forces recognized this change and exploited it. Infantry patrols reported finding empty bunkers that had been fiercely defended only days earlier. Resistance became uneven. Some positions fought hard. Others collapsed almost immediately. The sense of cohesion on the German side faded. The psychological effect of the AVRE was now fully developed. It was not just fear of the explosion. It was fear of certainty. Artillery might miss. Aircraft might not arrive. But when the demolition tank stopped and turned its turret, destruction followed. There was no uncertainty about the outcome. German troops began to associate the AVRE with inevitability. The slow advance, the short halt, the deep thump, the collapse. This sequence repeated often enough to become expectation. Once a pattern becomes expectation, morale suffers rapidly. British after-action reports highlighted this effect repeatedly. They noted that defenders frequently withdrew from concrete positions when AVREs approached. They observed that resistance often shifted to less prepared ground where defenders were more vulnerable. These reports recommended continued and expanded use of engineer tanks in future operations. The AVRE was never intended to replace artillery or infantry. It was a specialist tool, but in Normandy, it filled a critical gap. It allowed assaults to continue without pause. It removed the strongest defensive positions at the moment they mattered most. This success influenced Allied planning beyond Normandy. The lesson was clear. Fortifications could no longer be relied upon as decisive defensive measures if the attacker possessed the means to destroy them quickly. Mobility, flexibility, and dispersion mattered more than thick walls. For the German side, this realization came too late. Resources had already been committed to static defenses. Shifting doctrine under fire was difficult. Training, equipment, and mindset were all aligned toward holding fixed positions. The AVRE exposed the weakness of that approach under modern conditions. The irony was bitter. Fortifications were built to save lives by providing protection. In Normandy, they did the opposite. They concentrated men in confined spaces and made them vulnerable to a weapon designed specifically to collapse those spaces. One German company commander summarized the situation in a report that circulated quietly. He stated that remaining in concrete bunkers when British demolition tanks approached ensured casualties. He recommended withdrawal from fixed positions even though it violated standing orders. Survival required movement, not shelter. This was a fundamental admission of failure. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to compensate for numerical inferiority. It was supposed to allow smaller forces to hold larger ones at bay. Instead, it became an advantage for the attacker, providing clearly defined targets that could be destroyed in sequence. The Havre did not win Normandy on its own. Victory came from coordination, logistics, air power, and infantry courage. But the demolition tank removed one of the greatest obstacles to success. It broke the fortress problem that had stalled armies for years. For British infantry, the change was deeply personal. Men who had once dreaded bunker assaults now advanced with greater confidence. They trusted the tank beside them. They trusted the engineers who had built a weapon to solve the problem they faced at the front line. The weapon itself remained visually unimpressive. The stubby tube still looked wrong. It lacked the elegance of a long gun barrel. But by now, appearances no longer mattered. Results did. German troops no longer laughed when they saw it. Recognition replaced mockery. The sight of the short, wide weapon triggered immediate reactions. Either urgent attempts to engage it or rapid withdrawal from its path. Both outcomes favored the attacker. As the campaign moved beyond Normandy, the lesson endured. Fortifications alone could not stop a determined and well-equipped force. Protection was no longer about thickness of concrete. It was about adaptability and movement. The flying dustbin earned its place in history not through sophistication, but through purpose. It was designed for a single task and performed it brutally well. It erased bunkers. It erased assumptions. It erased confidence built on static defense. In the end, the most terrifying aspect of the weapon was not its explosive power. It was what it represented, a clear message delivered in concrete dust and twisted steel. There was no place to hide anymore. When concrete became a coffin, the war moved on without it.